And everyone, it's really, really great to be here with all of you watching us from different social networks that we are broadcasting live today, not just LinkedIn, but also Facebook and YouTube. It's really great to have you all watching us and taking a little bit of your time to be with us today. It's a pleasure for me to have with me, as usual, my co-host, Martin Duffy. Martin, glad to have you here again, my friend.
Thanks, Paul. Great to be here.
And also to introduce two guests that are so dear to me in many different ways. David Gurteen is a mentor in facilitation, a person that is, with him, I co-hosted Visual Collab in this glorious 2018. David, you remember that? I learned a lot with David, and it was a pleasure to have this event hosted in the Royal Society of Arts in London.
Yeah, that was tremendous fun.
And it was incredible. And Neves is a knowledge manager, known ex-consultant in Portugal, and not only in Portugal, all over the world, because she hosts Social Now. She is also connected to me because she took part in this Visual Collab 2018 event, and it was amazing to see. For the first time in my time in my life, we had an outside group, a virtual group that was more engaged and more active than the actual physical group in the room. And it was a major learning for me that there's no boundaries to human connection if we have the proper conversation method. But that's already getting inside the topic of this conversation. I don't want to do that for the moment. And perhaps we could start with a round of introductions, starting by yourself, Martin, right? Because people already following me, they know me. So Martin, a little bit words about you, and then probably we'll introduce our dear guest speakers.
Yeah, well, I suppose just how yourself and myself came in contact, Paul, was through the book that you were writing on virtual meetings. And the other contributors to that book, I was one of the joint contributors with Kelvin McGrath, dealing with meeting quality. And it was the whole study of meetings. I started studying meetings in an academic context back in 2011. And that brought me on a very different journey to my previous consulting work. So I suppose that's how Paul and I came to be in contact with each other. So I'm really looking forward to our conversation today to learn a little bit more about conversation.
Definitely, Martin. And I will be challenging you as my co-host on some meeting expertise for these dear guests. So
no problem.
David and Anna, by alphabetical order, Anna, what do you like the audience that is watching us right now to know about you?
Okay, so there's this year is a cause for celebration for me because I've been running a website on knowledge management and organizational learning for 20 years now. And it's just been amazing, all the stuff that I've learned in the process. And one thing that strikes me, and I'd like to share that with other people, is that I'm still as passionate about knowledge management and organizational learning now as I was 20 years ago when I started the website. And for me, the importance of managing knowledge, making it flow, making it reach people when they need, and having great conversations is still very dear to me. So I'm delighted to be here with you and having this conversation, especially with David, who I've known and admired for so long.
Yes.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Anna. And David, well, you're a known person, especially for the ones that approach the field of knowledge management, the inventor of the Knowledge Cafe method that I love. What do you like the participants, the persons that are watching us right now to know more about you, David?
Okay. If I go back far enough, my degree is in physics. And I spent most of my corporate career in the software development world. So at heart, I'm a scientist come techie. But I started working for myself about 30 years ago now. pretty much fundamentally focused on collaborative technology. And over the years, I don't know what happened, but I became a lot less interested in the technology. I'm still a techie at heart, really, but my focus now, my interest is a lot more on people and much more on conversation. And that all started about the turn of the millennium. I started running my knowledge cafes in London in September 2002. So we're coming up, hey, next year it'll be 20 years. I'll have to have a big party. So I've been running these damn knowledge cafes for 20 years. And they came out of my exasperation with death by PowerPoint presentations and trying to make events a little bit more conversational. You know this, Paolo. You know this, Anna. It's what I've been doing for a long, long time. But over recent years, I've become a lot more interested in, well, I guess two things. One, conversation itself and the importance and the central role of conversation in our lives. And so I've been writing this online book. It's a cross between a blog and a book on conversational leadership. So a lot more interested in conversation itself, but now these days far more interested in societal issues rather than business issues, because we face so many problems in the world today that, to my mind, the only way maybe not the only way, but the main tool we have for making progress is conversation, making better sense of the world and building stronger, deeper relationships in order to move forward. So that's a little bit, actually quite a lot about me.
Thank you so much, David. But well, let's start with not the obvious question, right? Because everybody is eager to understand more about what is called conversational leadership and conversational methods. But quick question, David, and fill in Anna and obviously Martin. What will be the case where conversational leadership could never be applied or would be totally ineffective, David?
I'm not so sure there's any area in human life where it would be ineffective or inappropriate. Conversations, human language evolved 50,000 years ago. It was called the cognitive revolution. It was called at times the Great Leap Forward. So Homo sapiens, human beings like you and I, have been around 200,000 years ago, but 50,000 years ago, something magic happened. And that was the evolution of language. And it enabled us to pass down our knowledge for the first time culturally rather than through our genes. And that's what we've been doing for 50,000 years. And it's very hard to see that conversation is ever a bad thing. I think sometimes it is impossible to have conversations with certain people and in certain situations. There are certain, if you like, prerequisites, if you will, to having an effective conversation. If the other person isn't acting in good faith, if they're looking to lie and cheat and deceive, then maybe, well, not maybe, a conversation, a dialogue is actually impossible, and you've really got to walk away, and at times you've even got to fight them. But in general, conversation applies across all human endeavors.
It was a tricky question, but anyway, Anna and Martin, we would like to. Is there any particular context you have thinking about where conversation and conversational leadership, we have to expand on that notion later on, could not be useful at all?
I'm not sure, but interestingly enough, David was saying that he studied physics. I studied computer science. And when you ask that question, the first thing that came to my mind is amongst robots, maybe conversation leadership wouldn't make sense. Having said that, one of the things I worked when I was at university, still doing my degree, was building reliable systems and creating the setup for a system to be reliable and dependable, even in face of problems. And the way you do it is building communication channels between the different hardware and software systems. So even amongst machines, you do have to have the basics of conversation, because you do have to have messages being sent and messages being sent back acknowledging what you've been told. So if you look at the basics of communication, even amongst machines, for them to be reliable and dependable, you do need communication. So I'm not sure if I can envisage or think of a scenario where conversations are not the key or at the core of the problem or the solution, rather.
Okay, fantastic. And how about you, Martin?
Yeah, I'm kind of I'm struck, David. You mentioned two words in the same sentence there, which kind of intrigued me, was conversation and dialogue. And I'm just wondering, as to kick off a slightly deeper understanding of the conversation piece, do you have a clear differentiation in your mind between conversation and dialogue? And if you do, could you share that with us?
It's interesting. I don't particularly make a strong differentiation between the two. I tend to use the word conversation because it's a word that everyone understands. Where dialogue is a little bit technical, it's a little bit academic, and a lot of people may be turned off by that word. So the kind of conversation I like, is when it's dialogue, when we're looking to make sense of something together, which is really what dialogue's about. Dialogue's about exploring an issue. It's about being open-minded. Now, clearly, most conversations are not like that. Maybe not most, but certainly many. So there is a differentiation. Conversation, is a pretty broad topic. My mum wasn't particularly a conversationalist. I often say, and forgive me this, my mum's long gone, so but I'm sure she'll forgive me for this. I always say that the deepest conversation I ever had with my mum was when she would say, David, would you like a ham sandwich or a cheese sandwich for supper? That's not a conversation, and I'd say yes, I'll have cheese. That's really not a conversation. It's not really a conversation either, is it? It's an exchange of messages, coming back to your computer metaphor there, and it's certainly not dialogue. So yeah, I do make, actually there's three distinctions there, isn't there? There's conversation, dialogue, message exchange.
Yeah.
That's picking up on that, Martin. That's an interesting thing, because, and maybe this is a cultural thing or maybe a linguistic thing, but to me, a dialogue is an exchange of messages between two people. So your exchange with your mom, David, would be a dialogue, because you do have two people sending messages and getting the messages back. But for me, a conversation is something that goes deeper and tries and is based on the willingness to listen actively and to reply, and something like along what you were saying about being willing to listen to what the other side has to say, being open to new ideas, being in good faith in the conversation. So that I wouldn't see as a requirement in a dialogue. A dialogue is just me saying something and getting something back.
Right. Let me interrupt there. I think there are two. This is why I don't use the word dialogue. I think there are two meanings to the word dialogue. One is simply a message exchange, and I think most people think of dialogue like that. But I'm really talking about what's often referred to as bone dialogue.
That's right. Yeah.
That's a lot closer that's a lot closer to what you define as conversation, Anna. That's
Mhm.
that's where you're looking to make sense of something. You're looking to explore. It's as much about listening as it is about talking. So I just like the word conversation. It keeps things simple. Everyone understands what a good conversation is. Yeah.
Martin, how about you? Sorry, Anna,
Yeah.
you're doing something. Martin, Anna.
Yeah, you've prompted me to reflect back on a piece of work that I did almost 10 years ago at this stage when I was doing my master's thesis, and I was heavily involved in facilitating strategy workshops, and as the theme for my thesis, I was doing an analysis, a discourse analysis of a transcript of the workshop that I had just facilitated. And I was working on it. I wasn't finding anything particularly novel or new or interesting. And my supervisor said to me, how is the group dealing with conflict within the group? And I said, I don't really know. So I went back, I started looking at it. And that was my first introduction to dialoguing. So it was a group interacting with each other. And when I delved into the detail of the conversation that was actually taking place, I didn't find any conflict. And that's what made it really interesting. They had no conflict to resolve. They had different views, different opinions, different ideas. They came to different individual conclusions. But at the end of the workshop, they actually came to a shared conclusion. And what made it interesting for me was I had been facilitating these types of workshops for quite a long time, and I had never noticed that before. And it was only through the act of stepping back out of it, looking in an analytical way, that I saw very different roles that the individuals in that conversation were having. And maybe that segues us into the concept of conversational leadership, because it's almost as though in that particular group, it's almost as though the leadership resided within the collective of the group. There was no one person dominating. There was no one person taking a lead in a conventional, traditional sense. But the group had a very profound conversation on very significant issues, had a number of disagreements without disagreeing, and then reached a shared conclusion at the end of their conversation that caused me to take my own kind of practice and my own research in a very different direction to where it had previously been. So that's partly why I asked the question, David, about conversation versus dialogue. And Anna, I'm particularly curious about your characterization there of systems requiring effective communication. And then how this, David, back to your point, the idea of conversation, not the technical dialogue meaning two, but dialoguing as a way of interacting with each other to understand rather than transmit. That seems to me to be a really interesting mix that sometimes we don't particularly look too critically at, and maybe we should look a bit more critically at.
Yeah, there's let me share you a real story. Actually, still back at uni. We've been doing this for a long time now. It's just really scary. I was analyzing the messages shared on a discussion forum at university, and someone would ask a question and you could have 20, 30, 50 comments until one of our teachers at university would comment. And this teacher was a very approachable person. Everyone liked him, everyone respected him, and everyone knew he was very open to being challenged all the time. Yet, every time he commented, there would be no more comments unless it was a really good or I agree or something like innocuous like that. So the conversation would stop in the face of a comment by a teacher. And
Right.
I will never forget this, because this tells, and that's I think what triggered me to become so passionate about organizational culture, because there's so many ingrained behaviors that are part of our culture that it's really interesting to look at this. And just another story very briefly on the word conversations. I did a project some years later with an organization where I was doing social network analysis. And one of the questions that I was asking was something to do with hard to translate or even to recall the exact words, but it was something like, if you have a problem or if you have an idea, who do you have a conversation with? And this is the type of questions in the social network analysis where you just choose names of people. So it was a closed question checkbox. And yet 2 people in an organization of maybe 150 or something like that responded in an open text question at the end. In this organization, we don't have conversations, we have meetings. And I will never forget this one either, because again, it's all about the culture and what people perceive about the words.
We don't have conversations, we have meetings.
Yeah.
I mean, the reason I'm laughing is that so many meetings are just like that. So many meetings are not conversations. And one of my big bugbears is, how do you make meetings more conversational? They need to be more conversational. Meetings are usually a series of monologues, a series of people doing little mini verbal presentations at each other. There's not that to and fro that you get in a real conversation.
But how, David, how can you make meetings more conversational? And you're probably going to answer me with conversational methods.
I think a lot of it's the mindset, and a lot of it's sort of picking up on some of the principles of the knowledge cafes that I run.
Tell us a little bit about those principles, because perhaps that's also the good advice we could give to managers that want to become more conversational in their meetings.
Well, let me say something first. So often in meetings, there'll be somebody running the meeting, usually a manager, and what you've got is like a hub and spoke type of conversation. The manager asks the meeting, somebody replies to the manager. Somebody says something to the manager replies. It just goes, it's just like a spoke, a wheel and the spokes with the manager at the center. And there's never any time given for people to have a conversation around the rim of the wheel, if you will. So simply making time in any meeting to allow people to have a conversation with each other. It's such an obvious thing to do, but I think back to my corporate life, and it's so rare. It's so rarely happened. So one very simple way of doing this, and this is not rocket science, is maybe when a manager gives a presentation or asks a question, before calling for feedback or Q&A or whatever, he or she simply says to the group, now turn to each other in 2s and 3s, because often they're not sitting, ideally. Often it's it's a boardroom table or it's a lecture theatre type seating. Just turn to each other in 2s and 3s and have a conversation for 5 minutes about the topic or the issue, and then we'll come together and again try to have a whole group conversation. So here, everybody is given permission, if you like, to interrupt if someone's talking to the manager, and that's the spoke type conversation, and somebody disagrees or somebody has something to add. It's perfectly okay in the etiquette of the meeting to jump in and say, well, hang on a moment, I'd like to add something to that, or I disagree with that, or have you thought of so and so? Turn the damn thing into a conversation. It's not that difficult.
Yeah. And the results will be amazing, right, Anna and Martin?
Yeah, I really like this idea that David just shared. It's very practical, and I think it can be very powerful. The other thing I would say, and here picking up on my my other hat, which is I've been working a lot with the use of social tools to improve the way people learn and communicate and collaborate. One other thing I would suggest is meetings should not be about project update or activity update. And that's the sort of, if you use meetings for that, it's very hard to not do the hub and spoke approach or have that sort of result. But those sort of, I've done this, or that sort of questions that managers usually ask in that sort of meeting, you can have those online. We have loads of tools. They are, since we've been working from home, they are widely available at most organizations. So you can do that part of the meeting through the online tools, and then use the meetings for the conversations, for the decision making, for we have this problem, we need to make this decision, what experiences have you got, and use the meetings for that conversation. And then you shift the whole energy and the whole dynamic of those team meetings, because it's about coming to an agreement, coming to a decision together based on the offerings that people can bring to the table.
I'm sure, Martin, you can add 2 cents on these, right?
Yeah, actually, there's 2 points I think come to mind from what Anna has just said there. I suppose the whole concept, when you think about so many meetings that we've attended, and just touching back on David's point about the hub and spoke approach that meetings seem to take, you have to wonder how much of that is really about command and control, and about the manager, the leader, the convener of the meeting looking to control what's happening in the forum, let's call it, or in the event, versus, and now I lean back on a point that David made earlier, the distinction between conversation, dialogue, versus this one-way hub and spoke communication approach. So that then begs the maybe obvious question of, does that mean that meetings would need to be declared as a kind of this is a command and control event? I want to have report coming in. I don't want two-way engagement. Just tell me the answers, and then a different form is, actually, we're going to have a conversation. Again, just personal anecdote, an organization that I did some work for, I attended a lot of their meetings over a long period of time. And the most intriguing meeting that I didn't manage to attend, which they discontinued, was once every 6 to 8 weeks. The senior managers, I think there were 4 at the time, they had a meeting for 1 hour every 4 to 6 weeks. No agenda, no notes, no minutes taken, no preparation in advance, no follow-up. They just scheduled getting together to have a conversation.
Yeah.
And I was intrigued because I hadn't come across an organization who had done that before. And I said, wow. I said, why are you doing that? And they said, sometimes we get nothing out of it. We just have a blather. We just have a chat. But they said sometimes some really, really interesting stuff can just appear. And that's the bit that I kind of find intriguing about the conversational leadership piece. Because maybe it's where the pieces appear that we don't expect or anticipate. Is that where a form of leadership can emerge out of more focus on conversation? Is that where we would be looking for conversational leadership?
What I like there, Martin, what you're saying is that you're talking about serendipity. We're always focused on problems and solutions, and I don't know, being more efficient by not talking about the things that we, are not on the agenda. And we miss out on a whole load of creativity and a whole load of potential, because it's those freewheeling conversations where connections are made, where ideas come together and start to see things in a different way. See things more clearly, get different perspectives. It still seems crazy to me that it's not taken, what you described there isn't more common, because it's not very common at all.
And they actually discontinued that practice, interestingly.
Really?
Not after
Do you know?
Yeah, it was such a shame, because I was looking forward to being able to go to one of these and just listen to see, how does this work, guys? And they actually discontinued it before I managed to get to see one.
And here is probably where social networks can help and keep the dialogue and the conversations going in an organization, and Neves.
Yeah, and I was just thinking that case is really, really interesting, that example that you've just shared, Martin. But one thing, I do see that sort of things happen. Like, for instance, if you look at communities of practice, in a way, sometimes they do have that sense of that sort of dynamic where people just get together to share good practices without an agenda or without like the obligation to have an outcome at the end of it. Having said that, I see that happening amongst peers. And when we talk about conversational leadership, or when we talk about conversations and people being willing to listen to others, I think there's another element, which is people being willing to be challenged and be open and true to themselves. And if I may be a bit provocative, I think there aren't many leaders, there aren't many managers who are willing to have these open conversations, because they risk being challenged. And I think that is one of the big blockages. And that goes back to the culture and the behaviors, and goes back to these entrenched belief that the manager knows it all. And I think that we're making progresses, things are changing, but yeah. Meetings where you have this hub and spoke, they're very comfortable, because you need a yes or a no, you need a date, and nobody's challenging you. You're just checking a plan. If you have an open conversation, oh God, you may be exposed. So that's danger.
You touched on a point there, Anna, that's a hot topic for me, and that's this business about, it's the managers that are the sole source of wisdom, and they're the ones that are going to make the decision. It may be true that at the end of the day, they're responsible, they're accountable for making the decisions, but they're certainly not the sole source of wisdom. And one of the things I've got very, very interested in this last year or two is, actually for a long time, is complexity. I mean, we're all familiar with Dave Snowden and his work in Neves that I've been following for the last 20 years, and I think certainly you have, Anna. And the world has become, and is increasingly becoming, a far more complex place than it ever was. Yeah. It's an incredibly complex world. So much so that one person, one manager, even one senior management team cannot make sense of the business world. It's impossible to do it. There's too much misinformation, disinformation, information that's missing. Things are changing too rapidly. You always need to bring a group of a cognitively diverse group. I don't necessarily mean an ethnically diverse group, but a cognitively diverse group of people together to make sense of any situation before making decisions. And one manager simply cannot do that. And again, if you're going to bring people together in a cognitively diverse group, how do you do that? You do it in a conversation. It's okay.
It's really great that we are progressing here in terms of our conversation, and already a couple of points I took note here. And first of all is for signaling that a meeting is going to be about conversation rather than a command and control meeting could be a good option.
That's a good point.
And for a manager, before asking the next question, please ask the participants in the meeting to pair with each other and talk a little bit before engaging in the next point in the agenda. So these are useful advice for managers that probably are listening to us and trying to get their organizations more fluid, more organic. Mm-hmm. And the good news is for you managers that succeed on these, you will be successful. For the managers who are not able to succeed on that, you will fail. and you're not prevail, and this is the law of the nature, right? So it's like whatever you're going to do, it's the right thing to do, but nature will take care of you and will take care of the organization. So better stay tuned to the learnings from Conversational Leadership, which is a book, right? David, can you talk us a little bit about your book? I'm going to share it on the screen,
Okay.
the cover of your book, if you don't mind, so that people can find it on their internet. It's conversationalleadership.net.
There you go. That's it there.
Yeah, you're seeing now on the studio, right?
And that's the circle from one of my knowledge cafes before COVID.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting
Hopefully
circle.
I'm going to get to run one of those again sometime soon.
Definitely, and run them in an hybrid way, you know,
yes,
like we did in
the
RSA in London.
Yeah.
And then there's this video here that's a talk from David in the European Commission Knowledge Week. It's a rather interesting video that I recommend you to watch, as this is the application of the Knowledge Cafe method in practice, right? So David is actually a person that practices what he preaches in this sense.
Paul, could I just add one additional idea that managers might consider, and this going back to Anna's point about a bit of a challenge to managers, but there's an automatic assumption that when a manager convenes the meeting, that manager is going to chair the meeting. And I've had personal experience of this, and it's particularly interesting when the manager calls the meeting, but actually hands over the chairmanship of the meeting to some other party, not a facilitator necessarily, not somebody external necessarily. And if it's a group that habitually meets or regularly meets, you could have a rotating chair approach. So the person doing the chairing can now kind of separate themselves from the content and focus more on ensuring that the conversation happens in the way that we hope it will happen. So now it's a possible antidote to the hub and spoke difficulty that David talked about earlier. Very challenging, very difficult for some managers, but an interesting case study to see what might you get different out of the conversation if you took that approach routinely to managing your meetings with your teams or with your staff.
Yeah, I like that, Martin. One of the things I'd just like to pick up on there, in doing that, first of all, is the point you just made, is then the manager is free, if you like, to maybe gently facilitate the conversation, yes? But one of the questions I often get asked about my cafes and conversations in general is about, what do you do when people don't speak up? Or what do you do when people dominate the conversation, yes? And, the usual answer or the usual finger pointing is at the manager, is at the facilitator, the person, controlling the meeting, convening the meeting. So it's their responsibility to do something about it. And to my mind, what you actually really need is for everybody in the meeting or everybody in the conversation to take responsibility for the quality and the dynamics of the conversation. So when you're sitting there in your circle or whatever, and I'm not the convener, I'm not the manager, but I can see that Anna across the room is trying to get into the conversation and can't because other people are dominating the conversation. I speak up and I say, I think Anna's got something to say here. And I bring Anna into the conversation. And that very rarely happens because it's not the way that conversations and meetings are usually held. If everyone took responsibility for the quality, the quality and the dynamics of the conversation, then the whole thing would be transformed almost instantly.
Absolutely, yeah. No, I think that's a really interesting point, David. Yeah.
Listen, so let's Anna, I would propose that we are approaching the almost the last 10 minutes. Let's talk a little bit about technology, if you will, because these days technology is so ubiquitous. And I'm going to share here one of my favorite events, Social Now. Unfortunately, it was canceled last year, like Anna. But it's an amazing event where you have lots of previous editions. I think this was the edition that I attended. And I met David Gurteen actually there. Oh, yes, definitely. It was 2018, David, in Lisbon. So you see, there's a lots of interesting conversations going in Social Now. And but especially the usefulness of the technology to enable more conversations in the organizations. And can you expand on that, and then a little bit on Martin too?
Yeah, I was actually going to pick up on what we've been talking about, and this idea of getting other people involved in the dynamics and the like almost gearing the conversation in meetings, and going back to the idea that the meetings, especially when they are like about tracking progress of something, can happen online. What we've been seeing these last months or these last year is a lot of the face-to-face behaviors now being or happening online. So people think that by running their meetings online, they're now using social tools because the tool is called social or whatever. And all of a sudden we're all digital and we're all social, but we're just mimicking the old behaviors and mimicking the old dynamics. And one thing that is totally missing, or maybe totally is, I'm exaggerating a bit, but is really missing, is the opportunity of embracing the asynchronous. Because the asynchronous, what it gives us is a chance to have meaningful conversations that allow us time to reflect and give quality outputs. So meetings are also and can be a pressure environment, especially where you have certain cultures, certain types of managers, and the quiet person across the table, as David was saying, may not find a voice because of the dynamics that are happening in the synchronous moment. But that person can actually find a voice, and they have a really important voice on an asynchronous format. And I think we're still missing a trick there, because social tools allow you to do that. And the other thing, and picking up on my knowledge management hat, I think one other thing is that by inviting the asynchronous and by using these tools, what we're also doing is giving organizations a chance to retain critical knowledge. All those conversations, all the knowledge shared, all the lessons, all the experiences that can be shared in this asynchronous way are a huge are a treasure actually for these organizations going forward. And I think again that we're still missing a trick there. I think organizations are not embracing this opportunity.
Definitely, it's so true. And Martin, what advices would you give for the organizations to embrace this opportunity of becoming more collaborative?
Yeah, it's I think it's interesting. I think your initial question, Paul, about the technology, the assumption, and it's going, I think, to the heart of extending Anna's point there, that the assumption that because we use technology, we're embracing its potential, and that's not necessarily the case at all. We could use technology and absolutely kill completely its potential. So I think in the very first instance, a bit like what advice would I give to an organization about how do we do better meetings? I'd be saying, well, we'll take a very critical look at what you're already doing before you start taking advice from me or anybody else about what next things you should do. So I think the idea of reflecting on what you're doing before you make any changes is really, really important. And I learned that, I guess, partly through my own practice, but I learned it very acutely when I did my academic research work, looking at events that I was part of. And when I started looking back into them through discourse analysis, and I gave it time to look at what was happening, I was seeing things that had completely and utterly gone over my head during the events. So for me, I think creating that type of time and space in organizations for people individually and collectively to be reflective on what they're doing, what they're experiencing, and then to provide ways. And I think this is probably, it's central to Anna's work in the whole network area, and it's central to David's ideas around the whole knowledge cafe concept. But it's to create an environment then where people can safely reflect, where they can have a difference of opinion without having a kind of a head-to-head conflict with each other. And that brings us back to what we talked about at the very start, this distinction between engaging versus dialoguing. At the center of the dialogue is we're seeking to try and understand what's happening. We're not looking to just win the argument. And for me, there is so much that will come out of that if people give it time. The big concern that I have, and it's going back to a point that Anna made previously, the big concern is if our underlying cultures are all about the command and control, if that's what we built layer on layer on layer over many years, it's a very difficult culture to break in order to liberate the potential that the conversation can actually give us. So it's a slow one. I don't think there's an easy fix. What's the solution? But I would suggest a starting point is create time and space for safe reflection. And out of that reflection, you can potentially create a really, really interesting agenda that now let the people go where that conversation takes them.
Fantastic. We're arriving at the 5 last minutes of our broadcast. So, dear guests, what was the main nugget of this conversation? And over to David and Anna, I think, to conclude this session.
Let me just pick up on something that Martin said there about culture and reflection, because I think this is an important point. Again, it's not very often in meetings and conversations that time is taken for reflection. When you give people, anybody, if there's ever a silence in a meeting or a conversation, somebody fills that silence.
Yeah.
And I've seen this in conferences where maybe, and I think I've done it myself many times in the past, you tell people to reflect, say, I'm going to give you a minute, not very long, to reflect. And they don't reflect. They turn to their neighbor and they look at their watch and say, what do you reckon we've got for lunch? Or there's someone to sit there and just quietly kind of go into themselves and reflect about the issue. It's not in our culture, and that's a big, big issue. And we've got to get so much of this. It's about doing things differently and changing the way we do things. Yeah, and I know I'm taking up time. Sorry.
No, nuggets from this conversation, David, or last final comments for our viewers, for them to take home for this time spending with us.
Well, that was my little nugget for now.
Okay, thanks.
Anna, what's your nugget?
I don't know. I don't know if there's a nugget. What I do think is it's great, and technology is certainly helping us with these opportunities of having good conversations. And one of the things I've been trying to do is to use technology to get and have regular chats with people who I admire, who are my friends, and just, again, as Martin was giving the example, with no agenda or anything, just let's have a coffee together. And I think that's really rich, and maybe we should aim to have that done in our organizations between managers and their teams, not in the sense that I'm doing this to be a good manager and get a perfect score when I'm to be appraised, but because I genuinely care and I genuinely want to hear from people and what they have to say. So I think this openness, this willingness to hear is really important, and also to listen to ourselves. I think that's also important, and that links to the reflection of us being able to listen to our experiences and look back to what we've said, what we've done, and how we can use that towards changing the future.
Thank you so much, Anna. Thank you so much, David. Our viewers are also going to leave us in a minute or so. We are almost 50 minutes live. Thank you so much for taking the time to being here with us. Thank you so much, Martin, for your insightful interventions here. And looking forward to see us all sometime soon in Social Now 2021, maybe, Anna.
Mm-hmm.
And we could have more conversations. Okay, thank you so much, dear viewers. And don't forget, if you're interested in learning more about digital tools for collaboration, you can buy our book, Beyond Virtual Meetings, in Amazon.com. You'll find a curated series of tools and platforms that Martin and I and other renowned co-authors did. And that's all for now today. Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you. Hello. Thank you, Anna.
Bye.
Thank you, Martin.